Hi everyone. In this demo, what I'm going to be showing you is how you can use Blend to build a more involved example that takes advantage of a lot of the kinds of things you'll be using when you're building your own Windows Store applications. So the final application that you'll build is something called Swagwatch, which is essentially a very simple application that uses a Windows list view control to display a grid of data. And this data is in the form of shirts or various articles of clothing. And as I'm going to be showing you how to build this application, I'll touch upon various topics that you'll run into, such as working with data sources, data bindings, working with templates, being able to arrange items using a grid, and a lot of other interesting features that are very useful, very good for you to know. So this is going to be pretty exciting, so let's go ahead and get started. Now that you've seen our final application, let's go ahead and build it from scratch. What I have here is Blend. I created a blank project. And what I'm going to do first is bring in some assets, some image assets that were already created for me, so that I can add them to my project. Let me first go ahead and copy them, copy all these files. And I'm going to go use my projects panel, which is this centralized location where all the assets, all the various content that my application surfaces can live. I'm going to go ahead and add my images to this images folder. Let me just paste it in, hit OK, and done. My images have now been added to my project, where I can use it in my application. What I'm going to do first is add the logo. As you may remember from looking at the application, there's a Swagwatch logo that very prominently is displayed in the top left corner. So I'm going to go ahead and just find the logo and just double click on it. Once I've double clicked on it, notice the logo appears, and we just add a standard image tag with the source set to the location of this image, relative to your project. Great. My logo has been created. What I'm going to do next is add our background image. We had a nice background gradient that was specified in an image that I want to go ahead and add to my document. So what I'm going to do is go to my body element, because I want this background image to be defined in my body, and going to go ahead and add it. So right now I have my body rule selected in my default.css style sheet. By default, when you have a new project, we create a body style rule for you, so you can quickly get up and running by styling your body without having to do anything extra like actually creating a new style rule. So I have my body selected. I'm going to go to background category in the CSS properties panel. So I'm going to specify image, and let's go ahead and specify the source to be bg.png. And notice once I've done that, we went ahead and displayed the background image into your document. Now, this looks a little odd, right? The background image starts off at the top left corner, but it kind of abruptly ends towards the middle. What I really want is to bottom align this particular image. And the alignment of an image, or the position of an image, is really defined by the position Y property. So I'm going to go ahead and say I want it to be in the bottom. Great. So now my image is bottom aligned, but in this process we discovered another minor issue. The image is actually tiling, it is repeating. So let's stop that. Put a stop to the repeating of it by modifying the repeat property to say no repeat. Great. So now I have my background image. It is bottom aligned, no longer repeating. The downside of this, though, is that if you look at the boundary between the background of application and the gray edge of the background image, they're not quite the same. And what I'm going to do now is specify another background layer, another background color that overrides this. So what we support is all the CSS3 properties, and one of the new functionality in CSS3 is being able to define richer backgrounds by defining multiple layers of backgrounds. So for example, the background image is one layer, and what I'm going to do is add another layer. And for this layer, though, I want the background to be a solid color. In fact, let's actually make it a gradient. What I'm going to do is specify a gradient whose bottom color matches the gray of our image. Let me get the gray just right. And whose top color is going to be the rich black look. Alright, great. So notice what I was able to do here. I went from having a background image that was oddly positioned to one that is positioned just right with another layer that gives you a gradient that basically ties in your background image to the rest of your application quite nicely. Great. So now I have my logo, I have my background image. Everything seems to be going reasonably well. I mean, this application seems to be coming to life quite nicely. So next up, what I want to do is start adding some data, start being able to show some of the data that will ultimately lead to our shirts being displayed. So there are various controls you have for being able to deal with data. Like I mentioned at the introduction, one of the most common ones is a list view control. So let's go ahead and just add it to our project. I'm going to search for list view, and let me go ahead and add it. The list view control by default is very plain. It's very boring because what the list view control really does is it really comes to life only when there's data defined inside of it. And guess what? That's what we're going to be doing next. When it comes to data, you pretty much have to deal with JavaScript. Now, I could use Blend to show off some of the JavaScript features, but realistically, we have a great tool in the form of Visual Studio, and we spend a lot of time in Blend making sure the integration, the workflow between Blend and Visual Studio is as seamless and as easy to use as possible. So let me go ahead and open the exact same project in Visual Studio, where once it launches, I will go and add my data source directly to it. So my project is currently being opened. Let me go and open default.js. So here's the code for the exact same application I've opened in Blend, and let me go ahead and add some of my sample data. I have a little notepad file with all the various notes that I need. So let me go ahead and copy my data and paste it in. And just before I move forward, let's talk about the data a little bit. I declare a variable called color data, which is nothing more than an array of objects that contain properties that are interesting for what I'm going to be visualizing shortly. For example, I have a color property with a hex value as its particular value, and then I'll come back to this shortly, but pay attention to the shirt property as well, because it points to the path of shirts as they would reside in our project. But for now, just remember color, and we will deal with the rest of it shortly. And what I'm going to do next is wrap this color data variable into an object that can be consumed by our list view. And that is, let me copy that line here. And that is something I'm going to be calling list view data, and it's going to be wrapping a color data variable into a list object. This is just a nice way of being able to simplify getting our data from code and having it be visualized inside of our project. Okay, great. So I have my data, I have my project. Let me just open this in just to show you that exact same thing I did in VS that's available for you in Blend. Let's open up default.js. Notice that in Blend now you have a view of the code file, and you can see the same data that I added into the Studio appearing here as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and associate this particular data with the list view control we have. So I have my list view selected right now, and what I'm going to do is switch over to the HTML attributes panel, the place where I can specify not only attributes on the element that I have selected, but in the case of Windows controls, also be able to specify various properties that are very unique to just them. The property that defines what data gets shown is the item data source property. So I'm going to go ahead and specify the data source that we have, which is called list view data. So I'm going to go ahead and type in list view data source, which is the property that actually returns the data source that we are interested in, and I'm going to hit enter. And notice once I hit enter, what happened on your list view. Instead of it being blank, it is now showing the blocks of data that we had in the array in our code. You can see each of these objects is now displayed in its own individual entry inside the list view. So this is not quite what we want as our final design, but it's definitely an indication that we're on the right track. We had some data, now we're at least telling our list view enough about it to have it show up in a way that we can ultimately style and modify it. Great. So I have my list view, I have my data. The next step is making this data actually look like something that is designable. And the way you do that is by specifying templates. If you're familiar with being able to design applications in XAML in the past, or even in HTML today, the whole concept of templates is what you use to create some HTML that gets replicated and applied to every piece of data that you have in your element. And what we're going to do is almost identical to that. We have an item template property, and what I'm going to do is say create new template. The create new template dialog appears, and I want to call my template color template, and I want to choose to identify it by class, and go and hit OK. Once I hit OK, Notice what happens now. Instead of the arbitrary row of strings that you saw before, you now have object displayed. But the thing is, if I select it, notice what happens in your markup. Instead of selecting raw instances of data, I'm actually selecting HTML. I see my template, I see a div, and the div I'm selecting is bound to just, in general, this object, which we can modify shortly to what we want. Great. So now we have our data, now we have a template that is mapped to our data. Now comes the fun stuff, making this data really come to life. What I'm going to do first is have my div. The size of it just seems very small. Let's go ahead and fix that, because the size right now is the bare minimum needed to display object, which is not particularly helpful, especially given that our shirts are a little bit larger. So let's go ahead and start styling and making changes to this. So first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the parent of my template and give it a class value so that I can control it a little bit, so I can style it with greater control. I'm going to give it a class value. Let's call this one color container. And because I'm primarily giving it a class value so I can have a style rule that targets it, I'm going to go ahead and say create style rule targeting this class and hit OK. Once I do that, you'll see that in default.css, the color container class has been, color container style rule has been added for me. And what I'm going to do first is specify the width and height to make it look a little bit larger. Width. Let's give it a width of 260 pixels. And let's give it a height of 266 pixels. Notice that as I'm making changes to my properties, not only are the sizes being reflected on the artboard, but every single element is also being updated as well, because like I mentioned, a template is a generic piece of HTML that gets applied equally to every single element. So even though I only have one instance of my template selected in this particular example where this rectangle is selected, the style I'm applying, the modifications I made in my HTML, apply equally to every single element there. That is why making a change in one, equally it was represented in all the other objects as well. Great. So now I have my object sized appropriately. Now let's get to some interesting parts of it. So right now it's just black. I can specify a background color that gives it a different look. As you can see, every element gets affected like I mentioned earlier. But what I really want though is I don't want just a single color that is applied to every single one of them. No, instead, each item is bound by this object that you have right here. There's a color property that has its own unique value specified. So what I want is instead of having one single color applying equally across all of the objects, I want to have each object display the color that its data is actually showing. And for that, we need to go into data binding. So what I'm going to do is I have my background color property. I'm going to go ahead and hit the properties marker and say edit data binding. Here, what I can specify is the name of the property in our data source that is actually represented, or that actually returns a value that is appropriate for background color. In our case, that is our color property, whose value is a hex value, which is exactly what background color needs. So let me go ahead and just type in color. And notice what happens when I hit enter. When I hit enter now, each individual shape has its own color, a color that is determined by whatever object it is actually hosting behind the scenes. Okay, great. So I have my object, I have a background color and all that. Let me go and delete object. I don't think it's necessary anymore. So I'm object. And what I'm going to do next is go ahead and insert our shirt. So I'm currently in the container, color container div. I'm just going to double click on shirt.png and hit OK. And notice that right now the contents of my template are the shirt image. And because the shirt is actually a template, a stencil, the background, which is specified by its parent div container, just seeps right on through, giving each shirt the special color that each one has. So that's kind of cool. So let's take a step back for a minute. So right now, if I were to go back to my application, I have a single row of shirts, which is not really ideal. What I really want is I have all the space available. What I really want to do is show several rows of shirts. And what I'm going to do for that is modify the height of the list view. By default, the list view has a particular size, which, as you can see from our CSS properties panel, is primarily defined by the UIDark.css style rule. And like I mentioned earlier, UIDark.css is a style sheet that's really provided by Windows. It's read-only, and it contains all the definitions for most of the controls and gives you the common look and feel that all the Windows Store applications would want if they're trying to mimic a typical Windows Store look and feel. What I want to do though is override that size, because for this particular application, I don't want my list view to be as narrow as it is right now. I want it to be taller. I want it to be able to show more content. So what I'm going to do in this case is I have my list view control. It already has some classes defined on it. You can see when list view and when swipeable. What I want to do is essentially create a copy of that class, or an identifier or a pointer to that class in our style sheet in default.css, a style sheet that I control, so that I can override the default size very easily. And what I'm going to do is right click on list view and say create style rule from element class. And what we do is we show you all the classes that are currently applied to this particular element, classes that may be specified in the markup directly, or in the case of Windows controls, specified dynamically by JavaScript. So I'm going to say WinListView, and once I've done that, you'll see that we now have WinListView, a WinListView entry in default.css, where I can freely make modifications without overriding UIDark.css, which is difficult anyway because that is a read-only style sheet. So I have WinListView selected in default.css. In my cascade, you can see that this is currently the one that takes precedent over UIDark.css already defined for the WinListView control. So I'm going to type in height, and let's make it about 80%, which is good enough to display 2 rows of shirts. Okay, great. So now our list view is sized appropriately, and it's specified in our own style sheet. Now I can go back and continue making some changes to the shirts that we already have. So I have my shirt. Great. So what I'm going to do next is display some text that appears just above the shirt. Now, the way I'm going to do that is by taking advantage of a new feature introduced in CSS3, which is the grid. You may be familiar with the grid from other technologies or from XAML, for example, but what the grid allows you to do is really specify much better ways of arranging and aligning your content, ways that are more complicated, more difficult, just using more traditional layout methods like floats and all of that. So I have my div, and what I'm going to do is say, I want this container to be laying its children out using the grid. So the way I'm going to do that is by sending the display property to msGrid. Once I've done that, you might not see too many things happening on the screen, but what you do gain is now the ability to specify grid rows and grid columns. I'm going to specify a grid row approximately here. The shirt shrunk in size. It's a known issue right now. I will fix it shortly, but for now, let's just focus on this area where I'm going to display some text. So I'm going to go and use a heading tag and drop it into this location. And what I want to call this text is, I want to display the color value that is actually being shown on each of the shirts. So what I'm going to do is go to my HTML attributes panel and specify the text content to be, instead of H2, I'm going to data bind it to the property that actually defines the color itself. And in our case, that is the color text property, which exists in our data right here. So once I've done that, notice that now our color value is being shown instead of the generic H2. And while I'm here, let's make some minor tweaks to the arrangement of this. For example, all of this text is really top left aligned. I want it to be more centered and just better positioned in its area. So let's go ahead and give our heading value a class. Let's call it the class color text. Create a style rule targeting this class. And let's go ahead and specify some margins and paddings, and just various things to make it look better in the amount of space that's available. Let's do padding first. Let's go ahead and give it a value of 5 all around. Great. And it seems like the height is a little too much at the very top, so let's make it about 7 pixels. And let's adjust the height of the grid row and make it 50 pixels as well. Okay, much better. Notice that now our text looks much better with the amount of space that is available to it. Great. So last thing I'm going to do here is modify the background color of this a bit. So instead of it being displayed in whatever color is going to be the default, I want to give it a nice dark color. Let's give it a dark black color. Let's give it a slight opacity. Let's make it 85%, so the background seeps through just a little bit, but not enough to impair your ability to actually make sense of the text that is being shown. Great. So next thing I mentioned earlier when I converted my div into a grid cell, the shirts shrunk to a point where it only takes up one particular cell. What I want to do is actually have the shirt take up both of the rows because it has more space available to it than what is currently shown. So just like before, I'm going to give my image element, the image element that's mapped to this shirt, a class value. Let's call this one color image. You can probably see a pattern in my naming here. And just like before, let's create a style rule that targets this class. And what I'm going to do here is go to the grid category, and the property that specifies how many rows this particular element takes up is msGridRowSpan. And by default, it is set to 1. What I'm going to do is say 2. I want to take up both the top row and the bottom row, so it spans both of them. And once I've done that, notice that now our shirts are back to the original size that they were in before, where they take up both rows, and they look like they're supposed to. Fantastic. So right now, we went from having a blank application to one that displays all of the shirts in our list view control with a lot of styling that we did that really would be very difficult to do if you didn't have a nice visual design surface like Blend that gives you some updates. So one thing that I decided would be cool is that right now all the shirts are pretty much identical. It'd be kind of cool to actually display a different shirt for each one. So at the very last minute, I worked with our designer to create some more shirts, and let me go and just add it to our project. I'm going to copy my shirt folder, and let's paste it in. I have my shirts project added. If you recall from our data source earlier, I had this shirt property, a shirt property that is mapping to a shirts folder with shirts inside of it. And what I want to do is say, instead of having our image show just one type of shirt, I actually want to display the shirts that are specified by the shirt property itself. So let's go back to my project in Blend, and you'll see that I'm going to go and select the shirt itself. When I go to my HTML attributes panel, you'll see that you see the source set to images shirt.png, which is fine for what we did earlier, but let's go ahead and just data bind it to the shirt property itself. And once I do that, bam, you now have each shirt displaying not a generic shirt image, but displaying an image that is based on the data that it is actually hosting behind the scenes. So now you have your shirts displaying as well. So let's go ahead and run the application to make sure it looks fine, because we are running everything, because the same hosting engine that your applications run in general is what we're using in Blend as well. You'll have no surprises here when you're actually running it. Everything looks fine. Everything seems to work quite well. There is one last change I want to do, and that has to do with what happens when you actually check on a shirt. This is built-in functionality that comes with the list view control, and the styling is also built in. And what I want to do is modify what happens when I right-click on it using a mouse and keyboard, or I believe it's press and hold or a swipe down on using a touch device. So what happens when I check an item is you see a border being added to it, and you see a little checkmark icon that gets displayed. What I want to do is modify it a bit. I don't want this border to have a little triangle in the top right corner, and I want the checkmark icon to be much more prominent, much more larger for our particular application. So let's figure out how to do this. So I know that I have this checkmark style, and I need to figure out a way of getting it to display in our UI. So from just selecting my shirt, I can see that there really doesn't seem to be much here that might help me in that. I have my color container, I have my image, I have my text, but nothing really seems to indicate that there would be a check mark that gets displayed here. Okay, let me do my next thing. Let me go to Style Rules panel, let me go to UI.css, and I could try now scanning this entire list of style sheets to figure out what might be specifying that particular look. That's also very hard because, as you can tell, there's a whole lot of stuff here. And I can search my style rules, but I don't even know what to search for. So traditionally, the way you would solve this problem is by essentially going through your style sheet, using a debugging tool like Firebug, and really spending a lot of time guessing and trying to hack at what might be the way to do it. What we did in Blend is this. We realized that so much of your application, so much of your application state, a lot of the visuals that you will be designing, won't always be available for you initially when you're building your application. They often come alive when you're interacting with your application, when JavaScript runs and brings in visuals that normally don't exist in your markup. So what we wanted to do was, how do we allow you to design for that very predictably? And what we've done is create a feature called interactive mode. So let me go and click on the interactive mode button. What happens when you go into interactive mode is that instead of now your application being running on the design surface where a selection is a selection where you can modify the properties on it, what we're doing now is passing all events to the application as if it were actually running. So now, inside Blend, I'm running my application. I can scroll through all the various UI, and I'm going to get back in the exact same state that I wanted to style in the first place, the check state. So I'm going to go ahead and get these shirts into the check state. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to exit interactive mode. And when I exit interactive mode, notice what happens. Instead of my application getting back to the default base state that it was in when I was designing it earlier, instead, now it's in the state that I left the application in while I was running it inside Blend. The state that I'm left in is the one where these 4 shirts were checked. And with this state currently in my design surface, what I can do now is try to actually select and visually modify the element that I cared about. So in this case, that is a check mark. I have it selected, and as you can tell, all of this content was generated dynamically by JavaScript. You can tell by the lightning bolt that exists here. And it's also, if you remember, we didn't have all of these content before because the state that I'm currently in did not exist at design time when I wasn't actually running the JavaScript that brings all these visuals to life. Okay, great. So I have my selection, I have my check mark. Let's go ahead and make it much, much larger. So just like all the other Windows styles that I talked about, it is defined in UI.css. What I want to do is create a way for me to modify it in default.css. And I'm going to do exactly what I did earlier when I made my list view larger than it was. I'm going to right click on my element that corresponds to the check mark. I'm going to say create style rule from element class, and I'm going to base it on the win selection check mark that has dynamically been associated with that element. Okay, great. I have my check mark. And what I'm going to do next, this might sound a little bit bizarre, but I'm going to change the font size property. A lot of these visuals that you have in the Windows Store applications are not defined as PNGs or images. They're actually defined as characters in a font file. So think of it as like wingdings, except modified and tweaked for the kinds of stuff that we want to show in the new kinds of applications we're going to be building. So the check mark is nothing more than a character in a font file, and therefore if I want to make this larger, I just modify the font size. So I have the font size property. I'm going to take it 150 pixels, and notice what happens here. Type 150 pixels, all of the checkmark instances that are currently displayed reflect the new size that I want. Great. So the next thing I want to do is, like I mentioned, I want to get rid of the top right border, the triangular border that you see right there. Let's go and change that. So when I'm trying to select it here, I have some difficulty because this check mark is now getting in the way of me selecting that item. So what we provide in our live DOM is a very easy way to toggle only at design time the selection or visibility of an item. So I'm going to just lock this check mark so it doesn't interfere with my clicks. I'll go ahead and lock it. And now that it's locked, I can more easily target items behind it. In this case, the selection check mark triangle. And I want to go ahead and just not show it at all. So just like before, I'm going to go ahead and add a pointer to this particular class in my default.css. And I'm going to modify this display property to be none. I don't want to see it ever again. Done. So now you can see that that particular item is now gone. So just as a sanity check, I'm just run my project again just to make sure that everything works, which of course is going to work, but it's just an old habit. So I have my application running in my local machine. I right click on it, and notice now you have the checkmark style that you wanted before. And the nice thing is, instead of guessing or instead of trying to use a trial and error approach in figuring out how to get your state to be the way you want it to be, you were able to very predictably use interactive mode, get your application into a state that you wanted to modify, and then visually design all of these features without having to do a lot of guesswork. And that I think is extremely, extremely cool. All right, so we're going to wrap things up by looking at our next demo, which touches upon how to build applications that work really well on devices.